Jim, my fiance, and I had just arrived to a party that I was really looking forward to because it was being held where I had lived before moving in with Jim. I had really missed this space. A wonderful couple, we'll call them N and M, had let me live in a casita in their backyard. The space was completely fenced in, and the front door to my casita faced a saltwater lap pool. M considered himself a steward of the property. N loved plants and designing spaces, so M took great care of those plants and the space. This love that they both had showed in the habitat around where we lived. It invited birds to come and visit, and every once in a while you'd see a wild rabbit or quail pass through. It was an oasis that they referred to as Casa de Sueños, and it was a space for me to, for the very first time in my 40 years of life, learn how to live alone and get to know myself without the influence of anyone else. They made me feel safe and protected, and I had grown to care for them deeply. As Jim and I entered the gated backyard, we began to mingle with the crowd, and I was hit with nostalgia looking at my old casita that was once my home and sanctuary, reminding myself that Jim was worth leaving this extraordinary space. As Jim and I made our way through the sliding glass doors that faced the back patio, I could see the whole nature and everything, and I was recalling seeing N and M having their evening drink while they would discuss their days together out on that back patio, watching the birds, right next to a fountain. What comfort their routine would bring me over those years, as we all shared that space. Jim struck up a conversation with some people he knew as we entered the main house. So I went to look for our host to say hi. I made my way down a hallway where there were a group of people standing around, facing a woman that was seated on the floor. There were a few people seated on the floor in a semicircle, and they were facing her. The woman was wearing a black dress and a black veil. She was covered in black. It was the kind of outfit that you'd expect a medium or psychic to be wearing, especially if it was Halloween. It looked as though she had a spread of cards laid out in front of her, but I couldn't quite make out what kind of cards they were. As I was wondering this, though, if she was hired as entertainment or if she was just a guest, she gestured over for me to have a seat in front of her. The instant I sat down, she leaned in very close to me. I could see the wrinkles on her face behind the veil as she made eye contact with me with a penetrating gaze. I felt my body kind of lean back as she moved in closer, and I let out an awkward, nervous chuckle. I didn't know what she was up to, but the room seemed to grow increasingly silent as she grew closer to me. The background music kind of tuned out, and all the chatter in the background kind of seemed to quiet down. And we were just all standing in this really low-lit room with this woman staring at me, saying nothing. And then moving like a flash, the woman struck me in the forehead between my eyebrows with her first two fingers as she said, "Wake up." I felt my body begin to lift up off the floor where I remained for a moment, suspended in midair. And then I woke up. Welcome to the home of liminal spaces. Welcome to the What's Haunting You podcast, where we work on healing that which haunts us. With me, Micah. Welcome. This episode, I would like to continue embracing the transitional season of autumn by discussing transitional periods, liminal spaces, and psychopomps. And yes, that was from one of my visits to my own liminal space, my dream space, a dream that I had about a year or so after moving in with Jim. I saw this woman more than once in my dreams after that, though, and I bring up the dreams, and I won't get too much in dreams. I have funner things to talk about. But there was a reason for it, the timing of it. There was another one about close to the same time, maybe a few months later, where I was kidnapped and put in an abandoned cabin. and these dogs came in to scare the guy away. They were like giant hounds. And then the door to the cabin swung open, and there stood this beautiful woman with her commanding presence. The dogs just aligned themselves on either side of her, and their eyes became red. And the full moon was illuminating the entryway around her as she stood in these black robes. And she just stood there, and I woke up. And this was all about the time I started going through a transition and didn't realize it yet. At least a year went by before I realized that this could likely be Hecate. There were other dreams too that helped me put these pieces together. And I had never even heard of Hecate. And I will say that some people say Hecate. I'm not saying which one is right or wrong, because the exact pronunciation has been debated over scholars over time. So we'll say both are right. And I'm just going to say Hecate because that resonates with me. But I'm uncertain why she came into my dreams, but the timing of it is what I find interesting, and I'll go back to that later. I do know that she rules liminal spaces, and she showed up about the time perimenopause hit me like a truck. I didn't know it was coming, but it did. Perimenopause is very much a liminal space. I think I mentioned that in the previous episode. You are in this space where you're grieving your former self, but you also don't know who you're becoming. And it's this space of not knowing, and it's uncomfortable and painful. Maybe the smack on the forehead was some sort of an initiation. I don't know. But as the perimenopause experience begins to ease up for me, and you'll recognize this when you go through it, and you may have already recognized it going through it, but as you eases up, you can kind of look back and see that it's a bit of a long initiation into becoming who you're meant to be when you're not so distracted with feeling the need to fit into societal narratives for women in general. And that is something I'll dive deeper into, why we have that issue to begin with, in a future episode. But for now, after doing last week's podcast about liminal spaces and doing more research on today's episode, I want to talk more about psychopomps. I had wondered if it was Morrigan, but she is not technically a psychopomp. She's a goddess, so maybe not. I don't know. Sometimes, though, the questions are more important than the answer, right? Maybe because questions are liminal, and that's where you grow the most, is sitting in the question. Let it sit and breathe. Wait for the answer to organically reveal itself in its perfect timing. Allow the discomfort to refine you and help you learn how to trust yourself as well as timing. So with this being the time of year that across cultures celebrates our ancestors who have passed and all things spooky and mysterious, I wanted to look into different cultural beliefs around life transitioning into death. Because to me, how cultures view their dead and handle the process of dying says a lot about the overall culture. You can see how a culture handles liminal spaces or transitional periods in someone's life by looking at how they view and treat the process of dying and death. I have to say that living in America, growing up in America, we don't do well with these uncomfortable topics. And I want to change that. I think it's important. The most growth, the best result of who I have been becoming has come from those uncomfortable liminal spaces, pure potentiality. We have recently been dealing with very close to our family grief, and it makes you reflect more on how our society is uncomfortable with some of these things because of our own fear of our own mortality. And I talk about how paralyzing fears are scientifically and every other way in previous episodes. But we just avoid things we're afraid of, and that doesn't make us stronger, it makes us weaker. And then when we avoid these uncomfortable topics, all of that pent up stuff we should have processed spills out into the world around us. It makes our lives harder, the people around us, their lives harder. And that's not what we want. We want our lives to be easier, don't we? Our ancestors saw that liminal spaces are actually sacred spaces filled with pure potentiality. They knew that there's divinity in being in a place of not knowing. The transformation process can ultimately be for our best interest, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. How do we utilize that? What I find poignant, though, is how no culture believed you should go through any transition, including death, alone. And I also, as I go through these, pay attention to how similar all of these are, especially some of them that are related to like the 14th and 16th century. But even before that, ancient times, these cultures that didn't really interact, but how similar everything was. It makes you think, makes you wonder. So let's start with what a psychopomp is, in case you aren't familiar. It's a figure associated with thresholds and liminal spaces. It's more often a guide than a god, although as you'll see in some of the cultural examples I'm going to share, sometimes psychopomps could also be gods of something. Psychopomps were typically neutral figures who offer protection, comfort, and guidance. Psychopomps are portrayed in many forms, including divine beings such as angels or spirits, human-like figures, even animals such as bees, dogs, dolphins, and horses, to name a few. Sometimes, though, they could also be humans who show up for people during difficult transitions, especially related to spirit work, such as shamans and healers. So let's start with the Aztec mythology, because the Day of the Dead is approaching. In Aztec mythology, there was a 4-year odyssey through the 9 levels of the underworld before reaching Mictlan. The ancient beliefs in the journey to Mictlan, the place of eternal rest for most people, were what formed the foundation for the Day of the Dead celebration, Dia de los Muertos. And I apologize, I do not say those words well at all, but I'm doing my best. The purpose of the Odyssey, which would be a liminal space, was a purification process and a test of strength to achieve spiritual liberation. Xulat, often depicted as a dogman, was an Aztec god and psychopomp ruling transitions among many other things that led souls through this perilous journey. He also was believed to guide the sun through the underworld at night. And if we go to Egypt, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it was filled with spells and knowledge to help the deceased navigate the journey to the underworld, or a paradise they called the Field of Reeds. Anubis was a dog-headed god and psychopomp, representing transition, responsible for making sure each soul was judged fairly when their heart was weighed at the embalming stage. So he was there for that as well. Scholars have found ancient Egyptian recordings referring also to a celestial ladder and a celestial river that they believe may have been referencing the Milky Way, which I think is cute. So, speaking of the Milky Way, though, many indigenous peoples viewed the Milky Way as a spirit road and a path of souls. So when you look at the Milky Way, now you're going to see it as a liminal space. I won't dive too deep into indigenous beliefs, mostly because these cultures, I'm not indigenous, and these cultures don't have one main belief system or psychopomp. Kind of varies over different cultures and areas. Generally, though, they did see quite a few things as psychopomps, like shamans, spirit guides. They saw animals like ravens, crows, eagles, dragonflies, coyotes, all as psychopomps. The Labrador Inuits, fun fact, saw the aurora borealis as a collection of torchlights that the dead would illuminate in order to help the dead find their way. I thought that was pretty. There are other mythological creatures the indigenous people believed in that would kind of work as a psychopomp, but they were much more menacing, much scarier. I'm not going to get into those. I think other people would be better to speak to those. So I don't want to go down that road, segue. But yeah, it's interesting. In Norse mythology, the most popular belief that we hear a lot about is around Valhalla, the land of the slain. But it was actually only one destination reserved for those fallen in battle. So I'm going to preface what I'm going to say about Nordic and Celtic traditions by saying that some of it is guesswork. A lot of the Romans destroyed a lot of any kind of recordings of what those people believed in because they saw it as evil. And what we do have recorded mainly is through the lens of some of the Christian ministers and stuff that would record what they witnessed, but nothing direct from, very little is recorded direct from the people that practiced any of these things. So a lot of things are speculative when it comes to especially like Nordic and Celtic belief systems. So let me preface things by saying that. But let's go back to Valhalla. Not everyone was destined for Valhalla. The Valkyrie were psychopomps sent to battlefields by Odin, who owned half of the dead, to look for the very best warriors to bring back to Valhalla for him, where they could practice battle, regularly preparing for the ultimate battle at Ragnarok. The Valkyrie, in earlier recordings, the earliest recordings, they were, I believe, always women, but they were much more menacing and they always have this bloodthirsty aspect to them, but they were a lot scarier and more menacing in earlier traditions. The Celts seemed to evolve them into being a little bit more beautiful and refined. But the original concept of Valkyrie was a little scarier. So the other half of those who died in battle would go to Freya, who was the leader of the Valkyries, at Folkvagner. Hopefully I said that close to right. That is a celestial meadow, which was part of the realm of Asgard. Norse mythology is a little more complex. The journey one would have to take would depend on how they died and if the gods had any potential use for them. That means that there were multiple psychopomps that escorted the dead souls to their final destination. But there was always a journey, a period of being in a liminal space before reaching their destination. And even then, they may be waiting for something else, like those who had to wait in Valhalla, waiting to go to battle for Odin. I was raised on the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible is full of liminal spaces. If you know the Bible and the stories in it, you've probably heard things about 40 days and 40 nights many times. There was always wandering in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. These were liminal spaces. That was a liminal space. They were being taught to be obedient, to have faith. It was always a moment of testing for them. All Souls Day was actually created intentionally 40 days from the autumn equinox. And they incorporated the celebration of Halloween to Samhain. So October 31st would have been All Souls Day. November 1st, All Saints Day. And November 2nd, no, wait, do I have that wrong? I think October 31st. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I think I had that a little backwards there. Sorry about that. But anyway, that's the reason for All Souls Day. It's 40 days from the autumn equinox, and they wanted to incorporate Samhain to Halloween and the celebration of All Souls Day. And then All Saints Day was the first. And they wanted it all to coincide with Samhain. Or is All Saints Day the second? I got myself all confused on that. Either way, it's really close. And one more point about the Christian Bible, Jesus' baptism was also a liminal event, representing Jesus' inauguration into the ministry. I do realize that in the Hebrew scriptures, that would also apply to Judaism, the 40 days and 40 nights of wandering in the wilderness, but that did not stop with Jesus coming to earth in the Greek scriptures. There were also the 40 days in that as well. And the baptism was supposed to be the liminal event as an inauguration into ministry. Baptism is a liminal ritual for humans to release their former way of living and washing away sins. It's a threshold. It's a vow to begin living a devoted life. The Bible has many illustrations of liminal spaces and events to prove that God is actively working with someone during these periods of refinement and guidance, even if it feels as though the person is struggling alone. The more there's trust and active working faith, remember, because faith without works is dead, according to the Bible, the more we are actively working on improving these transitional periods while also having faith, the better and easier these transitions can be for us. And at the end of these periods of transitions, there's always a lesson of hope or redemption, or a new lesson to learn, because the new realities always tend to be better than the former. But then there's always something else to learn, right? It just keeps going. There's always layers. In death, some Christian sects believe that Saint or Archangel Michael would be the one that would escort dead to heaven and also would act as a protector during that process. Let's talk a little about Buddhism. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is, I have one on my shelf behind me. It's read by Buddhists for those who are deceased when they die, for those who, what Buddhists refer to as they're in bardo. Now, there are a lot of different bardos in Buddhism. I'm not going to get into all of them because there's too many. I'm just going to talk about the main ones associated with death, because in bardo, there's a period, it's a period between death and rebirth that can last up to 49 days. The text of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is designed to assist the consciousness through the 3 levels of the bardos of death. The first being the bardo of death, the bardo of light or luminosity, which is the moment of death when there is pure consciousness and enlightenment. If this light is recognized by the individual, it can lead to liberation and freedom from the cycle of death and rebirth. And they're done. They're enlightened. But if not, there's the second bardo, which is the bardo of dharmata, the bardo of radiant truth or realizing reality. This is after death, when the consciousness is faced with projections of the mind's own fundamental nature, which can consist of mandalas and various peaceful or wrathful deities. If the deceased recognizes that these are not external forces, but empty visions, then they have that opportunity to achieve liberation. But if not, there's the final and third bardo, which is the bardo of becoming. If the ego has not yet been liberated, it enters this stage where the mind will have karmically driven hallucinations and imagery guiding it towards a new incarnation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is still being read at this point, and it's guiding the deceased to a favorable rebirth based on their past karma. I want to talk about Japanese mythology because of my Japanese granddaughter, of course. In Japanese mythology, the universe first created Izanami and Izanagi. And to condense for the sake of time, Izanami was the female who died in childbirth while giving birth to the god of fire. She went to the underworld, Yomi, where she proceeded to rule over the dead. That division that happened between Izanami and Izanagi ultimately created the islands of Japan. It's basically because Izanagi went to retrieve Izanami from Yomi and was mortified by her decomposing body, and so he left her there, and that created that division of land. Izanami is not to be confused with the Japanese more recent Shinto belief in the Shinigami. I don't know, I hope I'm saying that right. Shinigami is a blend of the Western idea of the Grim Reaper, a psychopomp, and Eastern philosophy, and is often associated with temptation. Shinigami can portray themselves as monsters, helpers, or creatures in darkness, of darkness. Speaking of the Grim Reaper, I think of Supernatural, the show. Does anybody else? They try to always remain neutral. That's a job of the Grim Reaper, is to remain neutral and just accompany someone on their journey. I suppose that's like I feel almost like it's an archetypal sense of a death psychopomp, maybe, you know? I didn't look into the Grim Reaper too much because I think we all know what that is. That is, I guess, to us, what these that I'm naming in these other cultures were to them. And maybe still are. I don't know. I haven't been to Japan or China or any of those for that matter. So please correct anything. If I would be happy to stand corrected if I'm saying any of this wrong, but this is what my research brought me. So I don't mind elaborating or correcting if need be. In Chinese mythology, the dead cross the Naihe Bridge. maybe I'm saying that wrong, probably, or bridge of helplessness. This is where their soul is judged before having the opportunity to reincarnate. And the more virtuous the soul, the easier the passing. The wicked may be thrown into the water below the bridge. I don't know why that's a funny visual for me, but no. Can I be that psychopomp? I'm just kidding. And then ancient Greek mythology, I think we're really familiar with as well. There were 5 rivers that led to and merged at the underworld, the realm of Hades. The Styx, I'm sure we've all heard the River of Styx. I think there's a band named after it from the 80s. But that was a female deity, as well as one of the 5 rivers that merged. But it was one of the main ones. I think it was maybe the main one, I'm not sure. But it acted as a very important boundary between the living and the underworld. So when someone died, their spirit, their psyche, had to cross the river on a boat navigated by a ferryman named Charon, 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 Charon. I'm saying it wrong, I'm sure. The crossing, though, was so important that great preparations and rituals were performed by loved ones after someone died to ensure their safe passage. Because if the spirit wasn't able to make that voyage safely, they couldn't pay the toll. It was believed that the soul would be trapped, doomed to roam the shores and haunt the living until granted rest in Hades. So this is where Hermes, he was Mercury to the Romans, they're the same, but Hermes has one of the most ancient roles of guiding dead souls to the river Acheron. I don't know if I'm saying that right, where Charon would wait for the souls. Hermes became the god of liminal spaces for his ability to navigate between realms. He assisted with transitions and journeys, including between the conscious and subconscious, the conscious and unconscious, this mortal world and the underworld. His winged sandals were a symbol of his swift ability to navigate liminal spaces. Hecate or Hecate, she was worshipped as a goddess of crossroads, liminal spaces. She was a triple goddess, often depicted with 3 faces representing the past, present, and future, as well as the three phases of the moon, earth, as well as the earth, the sky, and the underworld. It's a common misconception, though, that Hecate represented the mother, maiden, crone archetypes. There's no record that the Greeks saw her this way. This was a concept that was popularized by Robert Graves in his 1948 book called The White Goddess. So if you're like me and these archetypal life phases that sometimes they associate with Hecate, the mother, maiden, crone archetype, if it never resonated with you, now you know why. Because it was made up by a man, viewing women by their usefulness to men. Because to me, the most potent times of my life have been the in-between spots. And yes, maybe I was a mother, but I was also in the middle of a major transition. It doesn't make me less of a mother, but being a mother doesn't define me. It's an aspect of me, right? What defines me is what I do with that moment, as well as the transition moments and the difficult moments and challenges. To me, Hecate embodies the spaces in between maiden, mother, and crone, more than maiden, mother, crone. I think she's an energetic support when someone, like if someone is a child still finding their way, especially during puberty, when parents are expecting a baby, when a woman's going through perimenopause, when someone is nearing death, when someone is suspended in grief. Hecate isn't an archetype for the end of a journey. She's the embodiment of the sanctity of the journey itself. And what we do in that precious time in between, in the in-between time, that's what she rules. The more I accepted my own periods of being in a liminal space, the more I began to recognize how much effort and reverence was assigned to liminal spaces by our ancestors, and I tried to model that for myself and stop fighting it so hard, but embrace the moment while also trying to get out of it actively, knowing I will someday. Not only were difficult periods in someone else's life discussed openly, there's always been a community involved in supporting one another through difficult times. I would think about that. And I would think about the rituals that people would prepare for inevitable hardships and how little prepared we can be sometimes now. I've often found myself feeling, what's it called? Anemoia, when you're longing for a time that you don't get to be in, something you've never known. I long for a time when communities supported one another more than they do now. I remember being alone. I was alone in that I had no guidance or support from any other women when I was pregnant and had a baby. I was alone when I was unhoused. Sure, people stepped up and helped me, especially in the beginning, but it was exhaustive for all parties. Nothing was certain, including how long I could sleep at each place I was offered. And then perimenopause came, and I had never been told anything about what to expect, much less what could help me. And I felt alone all over again. And I love having the most amazing supportive partner in the universe. Makes all the difference, yes. But it doesn't matter how great your male partner is, or any partner who hasn't known what you're going through. They'll never be able to fully understand and support you the way another woman can through that journey, or another person going through whatever journey you're going through if they haven't gone through it themselves. I think it's interesting how Gen X women are stepping up finally, unlike previous generations, and saying, let's talk about this. I know I do it because I don't want my granddaughter and the young women I know now to feel like I felt. So many of us, Gen X people, have had to deal with virtually everything on our own anyway. So we're like, why not this also? I'm sure I'm not alone there when I say that Gen X was raised a little feral. We had to take care of ourselves so much that we learned at an early age that if we didn't figure it out and handle it, whatever it was, it would just get handled. If we did it, it wouldn't get handled unless we did it. So many of us can't ask our mothers or grandmothers either because they either don't remember, they still don't want to talk about it, they have dementia, or they've passed on. When you're going through something really tough, people are already spread so thin nowadays. They often don't have the bandwidth to help you out. If you've gone through any health issue, you know how isolating it can feel. Even something like divorce can do that. People seem to disappear when you aren't useful for them anymore. It seems to me that we've lost touch with the community spirit that our ancestors once had. When a woman was struggling, her friends in the same age group likely were going through something similar, so they would get together and help one another. They'd come up with solutions together. That's what helped advance our world. But then it seems like it accidentally maybe made us too independent. I don't know. I think there are other things at play there, again, for another podcast coming up. But for now, a liminal space will definitely show you who the real ones are. It will also refine you if you allow it in a good way, in a better way. It doesn't mean that it's meant to be. You know, it doesn't mean you're supposed to go through difficult things. We're not supposed to. But it does show you what you're made of, which is a silver lining you can look at, I guess. I don't know. That's what I need to do for myself. I'm not saying it's the right way, but it helps me. It doesn't feel like an initiation when you're going through these difficult times because you're just trying to get through it. And sometimes you're just trying to survive day to day. But when you look back, you can see that you were being prepared for something better, maybe. The more you can accept the journey with all its hardships while also fighting for yourself, learning and growing each day, the better you are going to be when you get to the other side of it. And the less likely you are to find yourself in that kind of a situation again. Each day that goes by, we get closer to that thinning veil that we talked about, right? If you follow my podcast, we've talked about that. The boundary between this realm and the next, we're closer to it as the days get darker. Do you ever wonder what you're going through now, how it's preparing you? What it's preparing you for? What's waiting for us when we cross over? Is it different for each of us based on our belief system? If we're spiritual people, and liminal spaces are the most spiritual spaces here on Earth, and we talked about that a little bit, thin spaces and stuff in the previous episode. Even if they're the most challenging, will we be met for even more refinement after we've passed on? I grew up Christian, and if the Bible taught me one thing, it's that the holiest work is never over. Another important lesson I've learned is how important it is to learn from the past and look back enough, like Hecate, have a face facing the past when you know it can help you on your current path. But you don't long for it and you don't try to go backwards because you aren't going there. Remain present as you plan for your future. And lastly, I think it's important for me to realize that maybe I've gone through so much alone because I needed to learn how to be my own psychopomp. So when it was time, I could help others navigate their own life transitions and difficult times. And maybe I'll be able to help myself a little bit better when that time comes to cross through the veil. Anyway, that ends today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please consider liking and subscribing if you do, and comment if you have anything you want to contribute. Questions, suggestions, or any other requests, though, if you want to keep it private as well, let me know. I will not do shout outs unless you ask me to. So I will keep everything private when you email me at what'shauntingyou@gmail.com. Thank you to Jim Hesterman Photography for audio and visual production. I have been your host. Thank you for going on this journey with me.